Okay, I'm pretty sure we are live. There's always a little bit of a delay. So I'm going to welcome people and then I'm going to welcome again. It does say that it's still setting it up and we are redirecting to the Facebook Live page. We are live here today to talk about the first episode of our podcast, Not Quite Magic. I'm really excited to be here with my good friends and partners, Liz and Laura. And we're going to talk about our podcast. So for those of you that don't know, we have a brand new podcast. We've launched an episode as a podcast with audio that's connected to all the different podcast aggregators. And it's called Not Quite Magic. And it's a podcast about interpreters. And our focus is really to bring to you interpreters that you might usually not see. It's not about talking to experts necessarily or talking to the big minds in our field, but rather, all the interpreters doing the work in the front lines on the ground that often don't get featured. And it's been really a great experience so far for me to interview people and get to know more about them as people and as interpreters. These are interpreters that are working in all the fields that we touch on: medical interpreters, court interpreters, conference interpreters, supervisors or managers of interpreters, interpreters of many different languages. I actually secured our next interviewee that Laura and Liz, I haven't even shared with them, but I'm really excited to bring on a Nepali interpreter. And she works with the Bhutanese refugee population. And I think she'll be episode number 3. But today I just wanted to remind you that today we're talking about episode 1, which was launched on May 27th. And it was an interview with Ernest Nino Murcia, who is primarily a court interpreter, and he works in Iowa. And hopefully you got to listen to it. And we'd like to just have a conversation amongst ourselves and with you through the magic of live streaming on Facebook about the issues that we talked about, that Ernest brought up so well, so eloquently, and anything else that kind of comes up out of that conversation. So we can, and we're going to do this very informally. The three of us have had incredibly busy week or month or life, and we're really just doing this as an informal conversation. So we don't really have a lot of preparation going into it. So please forgive us if I am not leading the conversation in any very organized fashion. But I'd like to start out just with hearing what you thought, Laura, and then you, Liz, about the episode as you listened to it.
Great. Thanks, Alina. I know, even somewhat disorganized as you describe it, or not prepared, you are an incredible host and interviewer. We didn't know we were going to get that skill set when we joined forces. The first thing that really, I loved the interview with Ernest because he just, I knew Ernest, but he struck me as someone who was able to give quite balanced insights into RSI, and then generally into the field of interpretings, which is a plural field that we work in. We work in many different settings and modes and modalities. I'll just kick it off by saying, because there's so much to go into, that immediately one of the first things that I connected with was Ernest describing his career, his interest in interpreting as exposure therapy for those of us who suffer from perfectionism. And I could not have said it better. I've said things that are similar, applied to my own experience, but that really nailed it for me, because I remember wanting to do a master's degree, for example, in conference interpreting, because I wanted exactly that, exposure therapy. I wanted to be forced to let go of the need for the perfect solution. And I thought interpreting would definitely be be the way to do it, even though, yeah, in translation, it seems like maybe I would be suited more for translation because it gives you all that endless, quote unquote, endless amount of time, which every translator knows that is not the reality, that translators are working under very tight deadlines and have to make decisions too. So yeah, that's my first personal response. Thank you, Ernest, for letting me be part of your exposure therapy family.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, I agree. It was very interesting. I don't, and it's hard to say this because it might come across as sounding wrong. I don't think I suffer from perfectionism. I'm a kind of, we can do it. Let's just put it together and throw it out there and it'll work out. So it doesn't mean that I'm not careful, and it doesn't mean that I do things that I'm not ready for in a professional sense. With my personal life, I probably do, but not with my professional life. But yeah, I don't, that's something that for me is not as, perfectionism is not a problem. I am overly critical of myself, which I think all of us are. All of us worth our salt are too harsh on ourselves, but so I do suffer from that. And yeah, I agree with you with the translation versus interpreting, because I came into the profession as a translator, and it never feels finished. You never have time to do the best job. And I think even Ernest touched upon this, which, actually in interpreting, you're done. So you do it and you can't really fix it. What you can do is how he really detailed so well, is prepare. And so much, it was really nice to hear the details of his preparation and constant reflection, right? He really, I don't think he's done collab, but he really embodies a lot of the principles of that, of the reflection and deliberate practice. What did you think, Liz, when you listened to it? Thank you. You were the one who transcribed it, so you had to really listen to it and spend a lot of time with it, right?
Yeah, it was a fun experience transcribing it, because I did get to dig into it, I think at a depth I wouldn't otherwise have just listening to it. But I want to start out by echoing Laura's thanks to you for just the great interview. I think your background in broadcast journalism really shows up here. So thank you for that. And I also really felt like Ernest's comment about interpreting being exposure therapy for perfectionists, that really resonated with me as well. Although that kind of working with that, and at times feeling maybe a little overexposed to my imperfections. But working with that, I think, is kind of the work of maybe a career and a lifetime for interpreters, and understanding that, when I listen to Ernest talk about interpreting, it makes me feel like this work moves us in a way towards an understanding that, like, the imperfection of interpreting is the human element. It's what makes it human, and it's what makes it good, and I think worth continuing to improve, which he really talked a lot about, his own efforts, listening to himself and thinking about new strategies, new solutions for the next time. So it's this thing that we're constantly working with and molding. And I also, Elena, I'm kind of like you, more of a let's just do this and figure it out, very comfortably exist in that flying by the seat of my pants area of life. And so I really appreciated Ernest's perspective of just figuring things out since the pandemic began for us here in the US, and just pushing for solutions that are going to work better for interpreters and people who use interpreter services. I actually felt really inspired by that, by his story of, getting, having access to remote call service to the jails. So yeah, so those are kind of some highlights.
And being able to not be listened in on was the thing he really had to lobby for. Elena, I'm going to jump in because unless you stop me. Because I think, I reached out right before this, if you all remember, in the episode, the day of the episode, the interview, Ernest was preparing for his first live debate. And so I was interested in getting an update from him to see how that went. And thankfully, he was able to write back. And he said it went okay for the first time. And so I love that he notes that it's his first time. So that keeps it a little bit, he keeps keeping himself in check and balance there. This is my first time. Like Liz says, I'm learning. And he shared a lot of reflections about the vocabulary and how, his booth mate got stuck with a couple of hard terms and how quite honestly he was glad he wasn't on the mic for that. And then what I think is so cool is he shared actually and maybe we can ask for permission to share the archived live stream, but he shared his interpretation and said, here's a snippet if you want to critique me on live stream. So all I say to that is, like, one, yes, really embodying kind of the ethic of reflective practice. And not only that, I think his exposure therapy is working. Because he's willing to even open up to other colleagues and try to solicit feedback and opinions, which can be, when done in a safe way, can be really, really useful to our improvement as interpreters. And then finally, just to give everyone an update, he thought it was really nice to do. And he's going to sit down and analyze and think about how he can do better next year. So yeah, that ties up a couple of things. One, commitment to reflective practice. One, vulnerability with colleagues and soliciting in the right way at the right time. And only an individual can know what that looks like for them. That's part of the wisdom. But soliciting feedback, the vulnerability to prepare and then try something new. And finally, wrapping up RSI, it led to a reflection that just on the new types of opportunities there are for us as interpreters, it's like, I don't want to beat a dead horse, as I said before, but a lot of people are now using the sound bite that, remote interpreting is not going to replace on-site, but that it will open up new work opportunities. And in a concrete way, we're seeing a lot of live streaming, whereas before in the past, when just people getting together online and online sources of information weren't so prevalent, basically there would be one medium that interpreters would possibly be given to work on if they were even given a job, and that would be through a major broadcaster, right? A television channel. And now we have this multiplicity of channels via which people are communicating, and a lot of them need interpreters to reach their audiences.
Yeah, he really, it was just such a good interview to start with, I think, because of that, because of the depth and the breadth of his practice and of how he presented it, and he was just so articulate about it. I was really impressed, and I was so happy. Thank you for introducing me to him, because I believe it was you, Laura, who said, ask Ernest. And he, because I didn't know him before that, and it was really nice. And then we had a lot of the same trajectory in many ways in our life. And of course I was inspired because I'm always having new ideas. So I was like, oh, I should also have a podcast about TCKs, because he and I are both what's sometimes known as third culture kids, because we were raised in a country that isn't the same as our parents. That's like a really quick summary of it. But, basically we were raised somewhere that our parents were not in, and we were fully enmeshed in that culture, but it wasn't for our parents necessarily. And then being in, the third culture, being kind of this third world that's made up of the combination of both cultures, because you still have a foot in both. And there, I do know several interpreters who are TCKs, and it's always interesting to talk to another one about it. We didn't get into those issues, but yes, I was like, oh, I should do it. I should ask him and all the other interpreters to start that conversation. But just the we started out the podcast about how he learned language. What was language learning like for him, and that experience of coming to the States and then being mute until he was ready, because he was a perfectionist even back then. And that was just really, really fun. I think, from what you were saying, Liz, about being imperfect makes us, is a kind of a very human quality that really resonated with me too. And it's what, it's when you look at communication theory and the little bit that I know, and applied linguistics and how people make meaning together, right? So when you're in dialogue, you're making that meaning together. So it's another part of being human, and therefore communication is that interaction, that you get. I mean, we don't get it with all types of interpreting nearly as much. Certainly conference interpreting, there's a lot less meaning making in a explicit way, but I think the conversation is still there with the interpreter in the interpreter's mind, because they're having to understand the message and kind of dialogue with it and then transmit it, what they get of it. And there's interaction, and there still is interaction in other ways, but that's another thing about interpreting that's so important, and such a fundamental part of it is the interaction between all the speakers, right? And in making meaning together, which we don't always talk about when we train interpreters, is how that happens, and how it fits in with accuracy. Especially when you're teaching, it's hard enough to get the concept of accuracy, I think, understood and really respected. I don't always have time to add this whole wrinkle of like that we're making meaning, but I see that you want to say something, Laura.
Yeah. Well, first, I think it was actually Liz. I have to correct the record. I think it was Liz who suggested Ernest. Am I right, Liz? You can give me a thumbs up. But either way, we were both
We're both on board with that decision. Yes. Love Ernest.
And it paid off. So going back to this idea of imperfection and its place in interpretation, so it occurs to me that we know, and we need to really center ourselves on the idea that, interpretation, many I have a trainer who calls it constant crisis management. It is the art of always failing. It is the art of imperfection. But we also know that, for example, machine interpretation or machine translation is not perfect either. And so it occurs to me that if we can really embody both of those realities, that it will make us less fearful and less tempted to enter into that juxtaposition of machine versus man, and be like, hey, machines, I need you to help me increase my performance. And machines are like, hey, humans, we need you to help us increase our performance. And I think if we can stay in that vein, then we might end up with a more productive relationship between the two parties, as they were, and hopefully end up with something better for the people we serve, a better product, better communication in the end. Elena, I love, the idea of the third world, and how interpretation is actually not just transmitting, one culture or one speaker's ideas and then getting it all the way over into the others, but rather there's something that happens in between, that we're creating this third world where both parties can meet, all parties, even the interpretation included, can meet somewhere in the center. And that was actually a big framing for even when we thought about the podcast art design, right? And it was I had never heard it. I hadn't studied that. It's not included in enough training programs, and I hadn't had it put to me that way, but it makes a lot of sense. And leads me to reflect on two things. One, if we are making meaning together, and it's about that interaction, there's a lot of talk, for example, in remote interpreting, about the layers of communication that are lost and how that can inhibit meaning making. And I can certainly relate to that. I mean, I in my experiences with remote, that resonates with me. But I think what's neat and that we often lose sight of is that, especially when everyone is online, it's not just the interpreters that are at a loss, that are losing some of that context. Everyone is losing those additional layers and having to find a way to drive meaning into other communication mediums, because of the fact that we're not in the same space, and so much communication is paralinguistic, I guess is the term, not necessarily bound up in the words themselves or the sentences or what's coming out of one's mouth. So that was one reflection. And then the other was about how that meaning making dovetails with accuracy. And to add on to your comment, how accuracy even varies from setting to setting. And I think Ernest did a really good job of clearly directing us towards the differences that we might need to have in mind if we are working in a new setting, or a setting we don't normally work in. In his example, he does a lot of court work, and then he was working in the conference setting, and he had a really keen awareness of the fact that using his court techniques weren't necessarily going to serve him 100% in the conference setting. And he couched it, I think, one of the most prominent, though there are so many other nuances, was in conference, the focus on delivery, the performative, how do you say that? Performative aspect of conference interpreting. And I just would love to hear from you all, either one of you, a little bit more about kind of the differences between the settings, and how accuracy in healthcare might differ from accuracy in court versus conference. I know that's a big question that's kind of like maybe addressed in a year-long program, but I don't know, whatever you all have to offer.
Do you want to start, Liz? Since why don't you want to start with that?
Sure, I can kind of tackle this as much as I can in a short period of time. Yeah, I think accuracy is such an interesting question, and especially what it looks like across settings. And I think, Ernest did a nice job of kind of beginning to flesh that out, what accuracy looks like in a court setting versus in a conference setting. In the graduate work, in my graduate work, when I came to my graduate work in conference interpreting, I had already worked for many, many years in medical and court settings. And I think what started to reframe the way I see accuracy as we traditionally define it, that kind of add nothing, omit nothing, change nothing madness, because it is madness. I think what started to reframe how I see accuracy was in my graduate work, just the constant reminder of who is listening to you, and what is the goal of the person speaking, and what is the goal of the person listening, or the people speaking and the people listening. And so I won't claim to know how to define accuracy and how exactly that differs across settings. But what I will say is that that's how I'm framing it now, is just by thinking about, what is the goal? It's so hard. We try to define accuracy and quality and interpreting. And I think there are some, in my work in quality assurance and healthcare interpreting, I think there are some things that we can nail down and say, this is what quality looks like in interpreter services. But a lot of times it's just comes down to, like, I know, a good interpretation when you see it or hear it, So that's my kind of non-answer answer. It's a work in progress.
I mean, I think that's an answer. That's not a non-answer answer. That really, it reminded me um, of my graduate studies. And so that you got that at Glendon when you did the master's in conference interpreting. That's really interesting to know, because it has a lot of translation studies and now interpreting studies as it, is kind of branched off on its own, because that's what we talked about, right? So my master's is in translation studies, and it was worded differently, but it's the same thing. Audience, it's all about audience. Who's your audience, as a translator, but it's the same thing as an interpreter. And then what's the purpose? And there's the functional theory, and it's all about what's the purpose of the translation.
That's amazing.
And yeah,
it's like we didn't even talk about this before.
Yeah, no, we did it, right? And so I was like, wow, that's really, yeah, we haven't. And it makes sense, right? That's why the three of us have been able, I think, to work together so quickly, even though we hadn't. We just knew each other very superficially, professionally speaking, and yet we've gelled so well. And I think a lot of it is that we knew, I did collabs, I knew where Laura was coming from with that, and I had seen a lot of your posts on that interpreter on your blog, and it's because of that, because I think that the general theoretical background is similar, which gets to that idea of like, is theory important, is it necessary, right? And the resounding answer, I think we would all agree, is yes, it is, if you can fit it into the practical side, which is what I like to think I bring to it when I teach, is to bring in the things that are useful, reminding myself that it's much more practical than just looking at it. Because when my studies, a lot of the people that I studied with were not practicing translators or interpreters. The interpreter actually was, but not the people that taught translation as much. And so they got a little lost sometimes in the theory. The third thing that we talked about all the time was power. And power is something that also plays into interpreting very interestingly, and this idea of accuracy. And it's, looking, and also when you're differentiating medical, court, conference, the three common ones, right? Even though we have so many others, educational being kind of the big one that's on the rise right now, I feel. And, that common definition of the difference between medical and court, or medical and legal, is that everyone in medical wants the patient to get better. We all have the same goal. We all have the same purpose, not in legal. And at the same time, it's even more complex than that. And thinking about when people are speaking, who has the power and how much power, an interpreter wields. I can't, you'll have to tell me.
Wields.
Thank you. Yes, because yield would be you're not taking that power. How much power you wield, and because you're the only one that knows the two languages in the room, right? You're the only one that knows something of both cultures, not everything, of course, but something, and can navigate, has a foot in both of those worlds. So I think that's, that's an interesting, and I was, by the time I finished my graduate studies, I was really somewhat tired of hearing about power, but then it keeps resonating all these years later, because it is important. And we see it now with what's going on in the Black Lives Matter movement and movement, and all these other things that are happening, and the marginalization and who has power. And one thing I wanted to say, which I didn't get a chance to say to you, but I mentioned when I gave the talk at Paving the Way on Friday, was I came across this researcher that's done all this research with patients about how they feel about remote interpreting. So few people are doing research on this. And there's a group of people based on a research grant at Ohio State University that are doing really cool research that not only are they doing research about the patients, no, they're doing research with the patients, with this this organization called PCORI. I don't remember what it stands for. I'll look it up in a second. But the whole idea is that patients get to help design the study, craft the questions, look at, be part of the interviews, be part of the data analysis and presentation. I mean, you know, this is really patient-centered research so that they can develop better patient-centered outcomes in health, right? And so they had this great webinar and they presented it. And Rachel Shostak, who is the main researcher that I focus on in my talk, she mentioned that she doesn't like limited English proficient as a term, and that she prefers to use what I think is a beautiful term that I'd like to try to adopt too, which is language marginalized individuals or linguistically marginalized individuals. Again, right? Getting at the power, getting at it's, and then I was speaking to my husband about it, and he was like, yeah, it's just like the term slave versus enslaved person, because it's not part of their identity. A slave is something that somebody imposed on them, and it's not part of their identity. It's not what they want to be. Enslaved person as a term identifies somebody else, you know, it's somebody else's fault, somebody else doing this to them, and it's not who they are as a person. And very similarly with limited English, it's not about them not knowing English. It's about them being marginalized given the context that they're in. Because if we were somewhere else, we would be the marginalized ones, linguistically speaking, and culturally, of course, right? So it gets to that whole thing. Anyway, I've gone on a long time about that.
Should I go ahead? Okay. Because there's so many wonderful things in here. Thank you. That's something I was really hoping would come up with, is the idea of power. And even though, you know, we don't have time to explore how exactly that dovetails with accuracy, it is to me as well an important factor to study and to have in mind, particularly I think of the healthcare setting, right? Because we have this sort of different mandate in the healthcare setting, which is in some capacity, whatever this means. This is what we, you know, the three of us really like to look at as trainers. You know, we have this added mandate to kind of ensure communication or for a positive healthcare outcome, or, you know, right, that's out there. And it's very hard to tease that apart, but power is in there somewhere. And I like how, you know, and it's really useful for me to think of, I want to adopt that term as well, language marginalized individuals, particularly, Elena, because first of all, language is not English is not an official language of the United States of America, right? And so couching, you know, and it even occurs to me that there are also providers who are limited English proficient, if we really want to get down to it. I mean, if we're looking at the whole range of ability in a language, and language marginalized individual really helps us understand why interpreting services need to be in place in the first place. It's to try to counteract or overcome that marginalization. And as interpreters, I believe this is not nonsense to us. We all believe in the power of words and terms to shape thoughts and realities. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be in this business, right? And so that subtle change, I think, let's start a revolution. It's already been started, but let's do our part. I think could be really useful, and I will note that down and incorporate it into my practice and training activities. The other note in there regarding power, you know, going back to Ernest's interview, and he was talking about when he went back to court after doing some conference work, how he actually used some of his experience to apply to his court work in a responsible way. And I'm really interested in thinking about what the settings can learn from each other. And that in opposition to the idea that I think that and this is why I really admire Glendon for treating the settings as just a horizontal spread of settings that we can work in, and that's what I think is the reality, that each setting can learn from each other, and that's in opposition maybe to the idea that there's some sort of like hierarchy or rung, like you might start at healthcare and move to court and then move to conference, that sort of thing. I'm going to call BS on that live on Facebook. You heard it. And I think that's one of the things that maybe, for example, conference interpreters could learn from healthcare, the healthcare setting, is that those power dynamics and the delicate work that healthcare interpreters have to do to take that into account, to navigate that. I don't have, we can't, I don't feel able to go into specifics, but I'll just put a pin in that, a bookmark, as something that the healthcare interpreting setting might be able to contribute to something like the conference setting.
And, you've both praised my interviewing skills, but, you look what you just did so well. You're like, wait, we're talking about Ernest still. We're talking about that interview. Don't get off on all these, because we could talk about these for hours, I think, even without any preparation. So thank you. I guess two things. Do we have any questions, Liz? Because I think you've been kind of watching. I was trying to watch if we have any questions or input from people that might be watching us live. And then, we could talk a little bit about more specifically what Ernest talked about in terms of remote interpreting.
Yeah, so I've been kind of saying hello to everyone who pops up on the Facebook chat. Lots of happy birthday wishes for Laura. We did have a question from Amal Haroon, who's one of our Glendon MCI classmates. So hey, Amal. She asked, do you think the main theme of the conference puts great emphasis on accuracy as a fundamental part of the interpreter preparation? I think this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of what accuracy looks like across different settings.
Go for it, Laura.
Yeah, as if I had the answer, but I don't have the answer. But what strikes me is that was one of the maybe the difficulties that I had when my interpreting heart comes out of the hospitals, like you two as well. And so that's where I got my footing as an interpreter. And there is a great emphasis placed on accuracy in healthcare interpreting. And I think it was a little disconcerting that in order to even begin to engage with the craft of conference interpreting for a moment, you have to let go of accuracy in the way that you know it coming out of the healthcare field for a moment, to even get a foothold there. And so it was disconcerting at first for me that there seemed, I'm not saying that this was necessarily the reality, but the message that I got is, sure, accuracy is important, but performance is just as important, right? So be accurate, but just whatever you do, don't let dead air on the mic, right? The show must go on. And that is, as Ernest pointed out, that's a reality in conference interpreting. And so there's a lot more to talk about there. But I would say, sure, conference interpreters are always, all interpreters are aiming to be accurate, whatever that means, in their context, in their field. But I did find it interesting that there seemed to be some other overriding concerns in conference interpreting that might be nearly as important as accuracy. I don't know, Liz, either one of you can let me know your reflections on that. And Elena, I wanted to tell you, if there is time, I did find some of those figures regarding diversity of income, remember, in the study. So if we get to it, we'll get to
that. Go ahead, Elena.
I think the issue of accuracy is definitely discussed differently in the different settings, and at the same time, even I feel that what gets emphasized a lot with the community settings and healthcare and court in particular is, the complete message, the whole message. It used to be word for word, right, or literal. We don't use that anymore. Now we say the whole message, the complete message, the same message, as if that the intent, the speaker had an intent with their message, and the hope is that the listener is going to get the same message, which is difficult because they're probably not going to, but you try to get as close as you can. And yeah, we could talk more about that for days, and also what Laura had said before with the idea of ensuring good outcomes. And that's one thing that I've told my students point blank, like, no, that's not our responsibility. You can't ensure that in any case. They might still have a terrible outcome, but the communicative goal is that you can transmit the message as fully as possible. And yet I feel that if you can step away from the words and still focus on getting the full meaning and the full message, there is a lot of it that's still about delivery in there, even in healthcare and court, and that you can realize that some of the additions are not additions, they're just as accurate. I was thinking of an example beforehand from a deposition that I interpreted at, in which the deponent was talking about WhatsApp, and many people listening, probably everyone listening to this, who's an interpreter, knows what WhatsApp is. But a lot of Americans, a lot of other people that don't have family or friends in other countries don't know what WhatsApp is yet. Maybe they do know it even a little bit more now, but this was, maybe 4 months ago, 5 months ago. And, oh no, actually this was a couple of years ago that it happened. Anyway, I didn't do it, but I kind of thought if I had to do a redo, I might have put a descriptor after the word WhatsApp in English when he mentioned it. Because of, again, getting back to the purpose, the audience, I knew that the lawyers weren't going to know what that was. I was pretty sure they didn't know what that was. And of course, then we had to have this long just back and forth about what is he saying? What does he mean? Because it was a file that was on WhatsApp. Somebody had sent a file, and they were trying to get to where is the file, and the purpose is really just to figure out where's the file. It's not, did he commit a crime, blah, blah. So to him, when he says WhatsApp, he thinks his listeners know it. They know what I'm talking about. I don't have to describe it, but they don't. And so then is it the role of the interpreter to just neutrally, kind of very in a nutshell, describe that? Yeah, I guess that's what I'm thinking of that for now. And I'm mindful of the time, and thinking about what Laura said about the different numbers, and also, yeah, tying it to remote, which is the focus of this first season of the podcast. And it was such a, timely focus to have. So do you want to talk a little bit about those numbers, Laura?
Sure. I think first, really quickly, I'd like to correct kind of something I threw out there. When we talk about this positive healthcare outcome, I think it does get confusing. And I think it is kind of useful from the perspective of the fact that what's fundamentally different about healthcare interpreting is the collaborative nature of it. So the fact that you're part of a larger team that's all working towards this larger goal. I think exactly as you say, the idea of placing the burden on ourselves, or the unrealistic responsibility that we would be able to, have the voice of God in whether we have a positive or negative healthcare outcome. We have to be careful with that. But I think as a way of thinking about a larger mission in the healthcare setting, and that we're part of a larger team, it can be useful. I think where power is most relevant is in one of probably the best concepts we have so far about thinking about our essential role as a healthcare interpreter, which would be the idea of communicative autonomy, which I guess was originally couched. I mean, I'm sure these are from large, these concepts come from many different fields, I'm sure, but I guess Liz or Elena, maybe either one of you would know, Marjorie Bancroft, really in her work, she was the first person that really put this out there with force into the field as a guiding pillar. And I really appreciate it. I think it's probably one of the best ways we have of conceiving our role. And so certainly power is going to be at play there when we're trying to think about communicative autonomy and how people communicate in general. And then it's like layers upon layers upon layers. So we're thinking about the power dynamics maybe between a patient, maybe an immigrant patient with or a language marginalized individual, right? And the provider. But then there's all sorts of power dynamics wrapped up in the interpreter as well. The fact that they're maybe the person in the room that has a certain amount of power because they have a foot in both worlds, right? And they understand more than the other people in the room, the two languages. And then what if the interpreter themselves comes from, which culture do they come from? Are they a first generation immigrant? How is that affecting the dynamic in the room? So I think really the best thing to take out of all of this, and I think this, Elena and Liz and I are probably on the same page, is that the idea, and it's been said, it's not like we're the first people to say this, but the idea that the interpreter doesn't have agency in an interaction, or that it would even be possible to disappear, or that the idea of a good interpretation is when the interpreter just disappears, is really unhelpful in giving us a north. Sum that up and then move on to one of the things that Ernest brought up, which was the fact that, I think he said he has his hands in several different pots. He's primarily, his court is his bread and butter, but then he's had the fortune to do other conference stuff, some translation work that actually comes out of his court work. And I think that's really a really important thing to highlight, especially for people who might be listening that are at the beginning of their interpreting careers, and they have this North Star that's like, I'm going to be an interpreter, and I'm going to sit in the French booth at the UN, and that will be my destiny, which is a wonderful thing and can certainly happen because there are people sitting in the French booth in the UN. But the reality of most interpreters is that they live on diversified incomes, and whether that's among settings, especially in the Americas, right? And whether that's diversity of settings or diversified interpretation and translation activities, or even other sources of income. And what I was trying to find, the study that Interpret America commissioned, I believe those numbers are reflected in that study, but I also pulled up the study that I led in Mexico for the Italia Moraita Foundation on what the dynamics of what's going on with interpreters and translators in Mexico is. And because I remembered it being the same result. And just to give you an idea, the general interpreters and translators in Mexico do not live exclusively from either translation or interpretation. And especially, and this is relevant to Mexico, especially interpreters. So for people who are, for language professionals who are mostly focused on interpretation, only 15% earn 91 to 100% of their earnings from interpretation. And so the majority of interpreters out there have a very diversified income. I think that's probably the most salient figure to quote here. Let me make sure there's nothing else that I wanted to add. Yeah, that gives you an idea. And we can link to that study and you all can see the graphs if you're interested in income and remuneration in Mexico for these jobs.
Yeah, I think, and that kind of is a good reminder to start doing that in the notes of the show. So we're going to post this conversation as an episode of the the podcast. Again, in podcasts, I don't know if they call them aggregators, but captures, whatever, Spotify, that type of thing. Because we can put notes in the show, and then there we could put links to some of these things that we talked about. So that study, and I'll put some links to a couple of the articles that talk about this, because for some people they haven't read about it before. Some of these kind of really interesting ideas and ways of thinking about it that aren't always brought into training. There's one by Cecilia Videncho that's particularly good, and my students at UMass Amherst this week were reading it, and it was hard for them, because she talks about how court interpreters, as interpreters, you are also making an argument, you're also lying, you're also manipulating, you are performing the act of the people that you're speaking for, which is that's a tough one to think about in many cases, so and she comes from, I'm blanking right now what her framework is. I think it's something in linguistics, I think, but it's or sociolinguistics or something like that, because they have this more very interesting rounded way of looking at communication theory. Yeah, Liz, we haven't heard from you in a while. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I was actually, thanks, Lena. I was taking notes while Laura was speaking about communicative autonomy. And I learned about this when I was trained to deliver the Community Interpreter International training that Marjorie Bancroft does in CCC out in Maryland. And it really was easy for me to embrace after nearly 20 years of working as an interpreter and an interpreter training, and kind of seeing how my own understanding of my work as an interpreter evolved along with my approach to interpreter training. And when I learned about a communicative autonomy, which maybe I can very, very simply say, everyone is accountable and responsible for what they say, each person, right? That felt like, wow, this is what I've been looking for as a trainer, to kind of address or approach rather one element of accuracy, right? Because I think in my experience training interpreters and supervising interpreters, we're all on board with accuracy, even if we can't quite define what it actually means. Yes, 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 accuracy, until someone says something really that kind of blows your mind, or is rude, or is going to be uncomfortable to interpret. But then we don't like accuracy anymore. And so I think communicative autonomy is really, really helpful in that sense. And something, just a little thing to add, as a trainer, I had in the Community Interpreter International courses that I taught, I had both spoken and sign language interpreters in the classroom. And when I was supervising interpreters, I supervised both spoken and sign language interpreters. And it seemed like the sign language interpreters got communicative autonomy. There was no digging in of heels. There was no, kind of going around and doing any convincing. And I think that, many, many topics we've touched on today, this, I think it has to do with the dynamic, the interpreters' backgrounds and the background of an immigrant community or a refugee community or the deaf community, and how all of those power dynamics differ. But those are just some things I was thinking about as Laura was talking.
Yeah, that reminds me, and then I'll let you go, Laura. That reminds me of one of my most memorable favorite moments with an ASL interpreter when I was at a hospital supervising as well. We had one ASL on staff, and the rest were spoken languages. And she said she was walking around with the patient, and the patient was making remarks about how many other patients were on stretchers outside rooms. There were a lot. It was a very packed emergency room. And I think the patient asked something like, "Is that person dead?" The the deaf patient was kind of confused about why these people were lying there in the hallway, and asked, and the interpreter, of course, was, said this question, interpreted the question, and then the nurse was very taken aback, or whoever was with them, kind of like, and was talking to the interpreter, like, you don't know this, like, blah blah blah, it was. And I think in other words, she thought it was the interpreter talking, and I think it really it showed to a certain extent about how much the spoken language interpreters perhaps don't interpret all the chit chat that goes on. They are making some decisions like that. Oh, well, that's not relevant, I'm not going to say it, which it's not what we're not supposed to do that. And I think it's really important not to, to bring the whole person to whoever, so that they are, which is what communicative autonomy is so much about. They're bringing who they are, regardless of if it's seen as bad or good, or right or wrong, or nonsense, or irrelevant, or something. So, and I am still watching the time, and sorry, I was here checking on my next appointment. But yeah, Laura, what are your comments? Because I know you want to get in there too. And we had a question too, right?
Right. That's what I wanted. A couple of good things coming in on Facebook. And Elena, if you needed to make like Liz the host or something and jet out, that'd be fine too. Caitlin was just a couple of comments. Caitlin talked about, she believes it was a New York Times article, and I believe I saw it as well, that highlighted a mini documentary that was put together about Indigenous court interpreters in Mexico, just because we were talking about the Mexico research, which was part of one of the big joys of doing the research, was getting a little bit deeper of an understanding about what the healthcare and court interpreting services situation is in Mexico, and how the dynamics necessarily do differ given that it's a different situation than what we might see in Australia or the United States or Canada or even the UK. So Caitlin's going to look for it. And if you find it, Caitlin, post it and we'll rescue it out of the chat and put it in our show notes. Amal had a great question about the code of ethics, because Amal is also kind of cross-trained among the settings, given that she was a student of the MCI. And so she was talking about how to solve the issues of the code of ethics to address agency in healthcare interpreting, specifically in Canada, where agency, or she uses the word advocacy, is out of the question. So for the larger audience who may not be aware, healthcare interpreters in the United States and Canada operate under different code of ethics that have been established for the professions in those two countries. I, as a trainer, argue that actually they're not as different as people might think that they are. And that really, though the words are different and the, I guess, permissions are different, the same underlying goal of communicative autonomy, so supporting the communicative autonomy of the people we work with, is at play. And Amal, I don't have an easy answer for you, except for the idea that communicative autonomy and accurate communication do rely on interpreter agency, whatever that, that doesn't mean necessarily in Canada that you should override the code of ethics and stop the encounter and say, I, as the interpreter, am here to state on my behalf that X, Y, and Z is happening. But there's certainly lots of other tenets, and that's the trickiness of a code of ethics in general, that the tenets are necessarily often, when you're in an ethical dilemma, it's because the tenets of your code of ethics are at conflict with one another. And so while everyone's pointing to the fact that in the Canadian code that interpreters are not allowed to do certain things such as advocate, there are other tenets in that code that that ask you as an interpreter to use your agency to further communication and communicative autonomy. So that's the best I can do on the spot, Amal. Marjorie Bancroft posted in one of her wonderful newsletters a link to some research that someone did about the unethical nature of code of ethics, right? So I'll just put that as a teaser. It's something I've been thinking about a lot And then finally, because we mentioned Marjorie so much, we might as well say, not that this was done on purpose, but it's quite nice that Liz, Elena, and I are involved in putting together, because we're trying to be timely and relevant to all of you out there, putting together a 4-hour training on RSI, remote simultaneous interpreting, specifically for community interpreters. Now, this isn't a training on simultaneous interpreting. And maybe Liz, you can help us by putting the link to the registration page on Facebook if it'd be, but we'll put them in the show notes too. And am I right, Liz? Do I have the date in my head right? July 1st? Liz can confirm that. It's a
July
4-hour.
1st, yeah.
Yeah, great. It's from 12 to 5. It's a 4-hour training, and we're going to have a much needed mental health break in the middle of it. But we really admire CCC and Marjorie's work, and are happy to be able to partner with them to roll out something thorough, but in a timely and quick manner. I think that's all I had. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. There was something that popped into my mind, but then I lost it. As we wrap up, I do want to talk a little bit about the schedule. So we have in terms of the podcast. So we launched the first episode on May 27th, and the next one is going to be a little over a week from now. So it'll be next Wednesday, which is the 17th, if I'm not mistaken. The idea being that I'm dropping them every 3 weeks, although this one will be posted before then. So we'll just have to get it transcribed, and then I'll post it as a kind of a follow-up. And that is the intent, is to have follow-ups for each episode. We're still playing with the format, how to make it interactive. We'd love to try to do it directly on Facebook, because we are transmitting live to Facebook from Zoom. So the 3 of us are in a Zoom meeting, right? And we're going to you. So it's a little bit less direct of an involvement, it feels. But I have to figure out, frankly, how to do that, how to get 3 people on a live and what we need, and, and we're open to, I don't know, suggestions and feedback about that too, because what you want to see out of it, what people that are watching this live and listening to the podcast would like to see more of, to make some of it, more interactive. That's the idea. And yeah, timely, because that's the thing. And I think that was a thought I had, was that I recorded several of the interviews a while ago, and so now they're already like, oh, how, they're pretty evergreen, as they say. They're issues that are ongoing, but then given that the focus is on remote, given that things with the pandemic have changed so quickly, sometimes it's like, wow, I want to get these out really, really quickly, and kind of think about the order. So I'm glad that in the training we can do that we can do that too. It's just constantly evolving. And the other thing is that I just wanted to mention, it's really neat that the different students and colleagues from our programs that we teach for other institutions, right? Not for ourselves, for Seven Sisters, are on, because Caitlin was my student at UMass Amherst. So thanks for joining us, Caitlin. I did not remind any of my students, but Caitlin is quite good, and she's really been accompanying a lot of things. And so it's nice to see you here too, and sharing resources. We created a WhatsApp group for that class, and it was really neat to see the students contributing so much. And that was the idea, that let's create a channel of communication that works for everyone pretty easily, that you're already using. And it's not about me telling you things. I mean, I post links too, but it's become such an organic thing with students sharing with each other, which is, I think, the idea of the podcast, and having these debriefings and really sharing it. And yeah, and let us know if you want us to focus more or less on the actual episode, how we did today, because we touched on some of it. Of course, we're trying to encourage everyone to listen to it. And there was so much more that Ernest gave us. So thank you again, Ernest, if you're listening, or if you listen later on. And if you do you want to each say something in closing up before I say goodbye?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, well, thanks to both of you. I love seeing the two of you live. Thanks to everyone who joined us. And just to land my last comment on Ernest, I put the link for our 4-hour RSI training with CCC in the comments of this post. And also, Ernest is giving a free 1-hour webinar on RSI and legal and court settings with kind of what I think they're kind of a dream team. Ernest with Amy Benavides and Tamara Hilton are doing that Wednesday. So I'll put the link to that in the comments as well.
That's great. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, and I will just echo that. I know I feel like this is pretty luxurious just to get together with you two, and then and then we put it out there, and hopefully other people will get something out of it. Elena, you are amazing comment from Jessica. And that goes back to, like, at the beginning, you were like, I'm not much a perfectionist. And in my head, I'm like, maybe it's because she's already perfect. Could that be? Elena's vigorously shaking her head. Anyway, Liz, thanks for pointing out that, that workshop. You guys, if you do anything in the court area, make sure you check that out, because these are amazing colleagues and really smart in this area. So check out Ernest. And then we have, again, the RSI workshop that we're doing. It's not geared towards conference interpreters. We have other conference trainings coming up. We're going to do some intensive peer practice sessions. For those of you who know Collab, they'll be somewhat Collab style. That will be towards the end of July, maybe August. I think we already put the dates on the website, or I will put them up shortly. And we'll open registration. We're not there yet. We're not there yet. We're plugging along as fast as possible. And then we're already full, but Liz and I are doing, Elena has been helping us as well with Sim Lab. I know all these labs are confusing, but that's for the healthcare setting, where it's a practice intensive that's collab style, but our dream was to, like, healthcare interpreters should have that opportunity as well. And so, we've put together a program of actual encounters with medical students or professionals in order for colleagues who are experienced and trained to get together and really examine our own work and learn from each other and have a time and a space to practice in. Elena's got to go. Get out of here, lady.
Yeah, I know. It's like, I actually have to go interpret. Thankfully, it's great. Because, all of us are still piecing this together, trying to keep working as interpreters remotely. So yeah, this has been great. Thank you. And we will see all of you, those of you who we don't see with our eyes, and I will see the two of you soon. This is a real treat. We actually don't get to do this that much, so this is kind of a way to force it, right? So we just have to do it, and I think it worked out well. So thank you for your time. Thank you again, Ernest. Thank you everyone participating, and for keeping us going. The praise is very much appreciated. Mm-hmm. So.
And for all the amazing colleagues that we have in the field that we mentioned, it's just like, it's wonderful to be reminded of how much good work is going on out there. Yeah. And thank you, everyone.
Yeah, how much generosity really is happening. That's a big takeaway for me. Yeah. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Okay. Now I have to remember I'll just end the whole thing, and it all end simultaneously, the live broadcast and our Zoom meeting.